Hey,
Hey, all right. Hey, internet friends. Hey, Pat. I'm Troy Good. I'm the founder and CEO of Courier, and today I'm joined by Pat Malatack. And Pat led our seed round. He is a partner over at Matrix Partners, but also Pat was previously VP of Product at Twilio for quite some time. Thanks for joining us today, Pat.
yeah, super excited to be here and chat a bit about the communication landscape and how it's changed over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I have to say, and you've heard me say it before, but I remind folks that the first 4 days of Courier's existence was entirely mine. And then, fifth day onwards, I've got to share the spotlight with you because we got connected very early on, and you know, it was just me and pre-product, pre-team, pre-customers standing shoulder to shoulder at the whiteboard, designing APIs and really building it from the beginning. So obviously, it was a great way to start, given your background and your experience, and helped us accelerate really quickly. So first of all, thank you for that. And I'm hoping that maybe there are other founders out there that are working in the communication space or have communication requirements, and they'll be interested in hearing more about your time at Twilio and joining something very early and evolving and seeing that evolve over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I joined. I can just sort of tell you a little bit about just what that story was like for me and
Yeah,
and
that'd be great.
how I joined. So before I joined Twilio, I was at Microsoft. So I was a product manager up in Seattle, and I had I think like a lot of developers out there, I'm a builder by
Hmm.
nature, and I'd come across Twilio. It's probably honestly, but like almost 2 years before I joined, and for me, I had a apartment building that I was living in that had a buzzer,
Hmm.
but you needed a Seattle area code, a 206 area code, to
Yep.
be able to like integrate with the buzzer system. I don't know why that
Yep.
was the case, but that was the case back then.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I had a cell phone and did not have an actual phone in my apartment at all. And so I was trying to figure out like how do I solve this problem. And I started doing some research, and I came across Twilio, and at that time Twilio was only a voice API,
Okay.
and so the product started. Jeff, John, and Evan built it out first, really wanting to enable voice communications. When Jeff was at StubHub, he had really wanted to connect a courier who had a ticket with the buyer,
Hmm.
and he had sort of
Hmm.
tried to figure out how can I do this, and at the time there wasn't a mechanism to do it, and that was sort of the founding story for Twilio. So at the time it was
Got
voice only, but I basically built a first just call forwarding directly to my phone so that I could buzz people up
it.
to
Hmm.
my apartment building, and then I started like most folks that start tinkering, I started playing around with a bunch of other things. I started assigning like certain friends their own passcode so that
Yep.
they could basically show up in the building. And I didn't need to buzz them up anymore. If I wasn't
Uh-huh.
home, they could get into the building. And so sort of just went from there, really had always had a passion for building platform products. I was working on the SharePoint platform at Microsoft, and so
Hmm.
really loved developer products, really loved APIs, and that was sort of my first taste
Got
in
it.
Twilio, just as a a Microsoft employee, just playing around and needed to
Yeah.
solve a simple problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's probably one of the things Twilio has become best known for is really being the first, maybe not the first, but I think probably the first big, really truly developer focused cloud platform, right? Where it was just get your API key and get up and running. Work on side projects, hopefully work on something commercial, but build cool things, right? Was the focus.
Yeah, and I think for me too, and it's sort of interesting because I think this has been the journey now for a lot of developer products, but
Hmm.
but really Twilio was doing this first, and a credit to Jeff, John, and Evan for having sort of the insight that give developers a tool, they will be
Hmm.
able to come up with really interesting ideas on how they can
Hmm.
use that tool and do things
Yeah.
that you'd never imagine,
Yep.
and I like then was working on so I was working on SharePoint, but I was also working on this task management thing at Microsoft. And next thing I know, I was like doing like voice memos where you like call in a number, and
Uh-huh.
there was like reminders, that all these different ideas that sort of started coming out because it was
Yep.
like, wow, now all of a sudden there's a set of things that enables access to, a whole area of that it never used to be programmable, and
Right.
a lot of new products now are sort of following this exact same pattern, but Twilio is really the first to go out and do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's 2010, 2011. Twilio is a couple years old. You're at Microsoft up in Seattle, obviously a big mature company working on a mature product, SharePoint. How did you end up working at Twilio? You've kicked the tires. You've enjoyed using the product. How does that convert into a product role?
Yeah, so I've been using it. Probably been using it, maybe 6 months, something like that, and I'd sort of been playing around with the product. They had in beta at the time was the messaging product, Twilio SMS, and I had was also playing with that and was sort of just really excited about what you could do. And at the same time, I was doing planning at Microsoft for what has since become Office 365 and a bunch of their cloud services. And I was also looking at what Amazon was doing, and my roommate worked at Amazon at the time. And so I had sort of been just in the middle of a lot of sort of just embracing cloud computing overall, and was excited about sort of what could be built with Twilio. So I did what anybody would have done that was sort of looking to change. And my sort of thinking was I wanted to go someplace smaller. I'd sort of seen how a big company operates at Microsoft, and Office was like unbelievably well-run division of Microsoft. It's a super well-oiled machine, and I wanted a little bit more sort of the what I learned later on to be sort of the chaos of the startup environment, but like I wanted something a little bit less structured, and so I was basically looking around and really applied for at two different companies at Facebook, which was kind of where was sort of the new hot place that everybody was joining. And then I also applied at Twilio, which is the place that I was like personally excited about. But I wanted to be down in the Bay Area. And so I like, fortunately I just applied right on the website. So like I didn't know anyone. And so like for folks that say like, oh, you don't need like a web page, or just like I just applied directly on the website. And they reached out a couple days later. I had a few different calls and flew down, and I immediately just really sort of clicked with the group that I met there. It's probably honestly it's like 3 weeks after I first met the team. I was I'd moved from Seattle and was living in San Francisco, so it was pretty quick.
Awesome. I'm going to ask another question, but first, I know you've shared a story with me before that I'd love for you to share again, which is my understanding is that when you showed up, things ended up being a little bit different than what you expected, right?
Yeah. So, and I think this is like just talks to like the dynamic nature of a startup environment. So, I was excited about the role. They told me I was going to build out the Twilio marketplace was actually the role I was hired to do. I show up, and the next thing I know, it's like the first few days I got into it. It was probably day one. They told me I wasn't working on marketplace, and that I was going to be working on Twilio SMS, and then by day, I think it was Wednesday, the first week I was there, they're like, well, you're going to be working on SMS, but like, it's super chaotic. All the carriers hate us right now. And like, it might get shut down. So you're the PM for this product that, might get shut down. And that was sort of the environment I had walked into, coming from like a very, stable, large, obviously, publicly traded company like Microsoft that had. And so that was sort of like my dramatic introduction into the startup life and sort of the environment that I'd be in for what ended up being the next 7 years.
Right. Tell me more about what did the team look like at Twilio? So they'd had the core product was originally a voice product. They were shipping the SMS product, either in beta or recently launched. What was the team like? The company was about 2 or 3 years old at this point, I think.
Yeah, it was about, I think it was like about 20, 30 folks total at the company when I joined. I came in really as one of the first early product hires. And yeah, it was about that, roughly that size, I'd say. And for those, I think actually a lot of people probably don't know that Twilio actually started in the voice space, by the way.
Right.
When I've chatted with folks like this, like, oh, I thought Twilio started with SMS. It's like, no, it actually started with voice.
Right.
It launched with Jeff Lawson, Rick Rolling, Michael Arrington at TechCrunch was kind of the launch story. But yeah, so the environment was a pretty small team. The messaging team was a team of essentially one engineer, and it was kind of like a shared responsibility for them. So there's one person working on SMS at the time I joined, and yeah, it was, I'd say there were a number of evangelists. There were probably at that point in time 3 or 4 developer evangelists, and folks that were sort of on the marketing side, maybe 1 or 2 others on the marketing side, and then there was 1 person, 2 people in sales, and then pretty much everyone else was engineers building product, writing code. I mean, I remember like showing up and at the time, Jeff, the CEO, was still like checking in code, and I was like, this. I'm like, I wanted an environment that was, smaller and more general, but like the CEO is actively checking in code. This is, very different than, how things worked under Steve Ballmer at Microsoft. He wasn't checking in any code there.
Sure, yeah. You mentioned something that's absolutely true, which is I think most people, especially a few years ago, thought of Twilio as primarily an SMS company. It was they would be surprised that voice came first. Today, they've obviously got a portfolio of different channels that they support. Voice, just looking at kind of the funding history of the first few years of Twilio, it looks like something must have been working with voice. They were able to raise, a few rounds of capital quite quickly. Do you know what led to the initiative to add messaging, to add SMS as an additional product?
Yeah, so I mean, you got to remember way back when that, like when Twilio was founded, the iPhone did not exist, which is kind of like a crazy to like, what was the world like prior to smartphones, right? But like that was sort of the reality, and when you thought about like how you were interacting with companies, you would interact with their website, or you would interact, via a customer support phone number, a phone line, right? And so this was sort of like the different channels the 2 sort of primary channels at that point in time that a business would communicate with their customer. And so it actually made a ton of sense to start there, right? That was the right starting point. And there were folks building a bunch of different things, like IVRs being built on top of Twilio. And Twilio had sort of these basic, which still exists today as part of the TWIML language, play, say, the ability to do, be able to build sort of IVRs and applications on top of the phone network. And so so that was sort of the original launch of Twilio and the original product that was there, and it was definitely working, and it was doing well. They were able to fundraise, and it was a growing business. But at the same time, as sort of the iPhone launched, as the primary way in which you communicate with each other wasn't this like T9 text input, which like only like nerds like me were like excited about T9 with their Motorola Razr flip phone.
Right.
What happened is that basically text messaging just completely took off. Right. So smartphones showed up. They had these full QWERTY keyboards, and basically what had happened was that the only way you were doing full messaging on your phone prior to the sort of smartphone was BlackBerries, and that was primarily email, right? Is really the what was happening with the BlackBerry device. And so basically smartphones take off, text messaging subsequently takes off, and Jeff and John and Evan are sitting there with a ton of phone numbers, thinking like, hey, why can't we text on these phone numbers? Like that's a thing that should be programmable, just the same way that we're making voice programmable. And so that was sort of really the impetus. But I think that the main thing that happened was, and I think this has happened repeatedly throughout the history of communications, is that the way in which humans communicated with other humans sort of fundamentally changes and evolves over time, right? And really what you saw was a shift in the way in which, we communicated with each other being primarily over voice to a lot more people doing messaging. And so then it was logical that like absolutely our application should be able to talk to us the same way our friends talk to us, right?
Yep.
And so this has been the pattern that I think has played out a number of different times, and certainly, while I was at Twilio and since then, we've got a whole different set of communication tools, and it usually starts with this: how do we communicate with one another, right?
Yeah.
You have now WhatsApp, you have Slack, you have,
Yep.
and none of it's very infrequent that sort of the legacy channel disappears. We're all still emailing, right? We're all still calling and talking on
Phone
voice,
calls
right?
still work.
Yeah, and it's really that people change the sort of the bandwidth of the communications, and make it more appropriate for the problem that they're out there, trying to communicate to someone else, or the thing that they want to work on with someone, or and so
Yep.
I find even for myself, like when I'm spending time communicating with my family, it's usually over FaceTime, right? Like that's the right channel. It's
Yep.
richer. I'm able to see what's
Yep.
going on. I can see the baby, my nephews growing up and nieces
Yep.
growing up, and
Yep.
and so the way in which we communicate with each other, I think, sort of starts with then, great, how do we expect the brands and the companies that we work with to communicate with us in a similar fashion? I think it starts with how we communicate with one another, and it sort of evolves from there.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it makes me think, and I don't think this is something I've brought up to you before, but one of the things I've always found a little funny, but now I think I get it, is Twilio often refers to what I would say SMS as messaging, right? That's programmable messaging. And today, messaging to me is a much broader term than SMS. But at the time when you were creating that product, right, when you're thinking about programmable messaging, that essentially just meant SMS, because there were other chat platforms, for example, but they were things like AIM and MSN, and probably Yahoo Messenger was still around. I think ICQ is probably mostly gone at that point, but
Yeah.
and pretty much all of those are now gone. So we've seen an evolution, but also I don't think any of those were messaging channels that businesses were trying to interface with. That's obviously changed with newer channels. But so at the time, messaging really just meant SMS.
Yeah, and I think what was interesting, we actually chatted being an overloaded term here because people also call it chat, not messaging. But we talked a lot about, should we be building things that integrate with those services? And I think what we just generally observed is that, as I said, as the technology changes, the landscape and the tools used for communicating change. And really what had happened is that the smartphone, the rise and emergence of the smartphone changed how people thought about what messaging was. It moved from, only this sort of synchronous AIM type chat into these sort of hybrid async sync modes, which is largely what you have now with WhatsApp, where it's like it is async by default, but I get my typing indicator, and then it sort of can auto upgrade to a more synchronous chat experience. And so what we saw was basically that was emerging as sort of the new place in which folks were having these sort of experiences. And obviously, the AIMs of the world, went down as the WhatsApps of the world went up. But that was all enabled by the fact that you now had this smartphone that had a persistent connection to the internet, that had push notifications. Like, remember, push notifications were also not a thing back in the day, right?
Yeah.
And if I think a lot of people may forget, and maybe this is making me sound a bit older, but like Twitter was over SMS.
You're right.
And so Twitter, really started off, and so all the limitations and the number of characters in your tweet, this is all driven by GSM networks and how they could do character encoding in an SMS world, right? And so and all that changed as the rise of the app stores happened and evolved. But that was really, if you think about Twilio as being founded before the iPhone, that was really what the environment looked like at that point in time.
Absolutely. And I know that there are a couple products that have in the Twilio portfolio that have some degree for push support, but I get the impression that was never really a focus for Twilio. Would that be correct or incorrect? Where did push? I guess first to iPhone and then eventually to Android. Where did that fit into the messaging ecosystem?
Yeah, so really, I think, as we looked at, there were a bunch of different players that were in the push space. And so, back, circa 2011, there
Yep.
was, players like Urban Airship and,
Mhm.
and others that were really focused exclusively on push. And as we looked at the problem, we were focused on how does a business communicate with its customers?
Mhm.
And remember, the smartphone world had just sort of gotten kicked off
Yep.
then, and,
Yep.
and everyone had a cell phone, or many
Mhm.
folks had a cell phone. Not everyone had a smartphone initially,
Yep.
and more importantly, I'd say businesses didn't necessarily have mobile apps either, right?
Right.
And so, and there's still many businesses that don't
Yeah.
have mobile apps.
Yep.
When I don't have a PG&E mobile app, but I sure would
Right.
like to know when they're going to shut off power in California, right? And so, I think in terms of having a universal addressable identity, frankly, email and the phone number are those universal addressable identities, I think.
Mhm.
And so that was sort of where we had focused because we really wanted
Mhm.
to empower all businesses to be able to communicate directly with their customers. Over time, we did add push to the platform
Mhm.
at Twilio through
Yep.
a product called Notify.
Yep.
But early on, we were really, and I would say my first, I joined, and at the time the Twilio SMS product was US only.
Mhm.
We didn't have shortcodes. We launched shortcodes shortly after I joined,
Yep.
which is now a pretty big product, and I think a lot of people are
Mhm.
familiar with shortcodes these days.
Yep.
But that all happened after I joined, and we also tried to launch internationally. We launched first in the UK to try and figure out what that market. Then we incrementally launched in a bunch of different countries around the world. But the product was a US only product,
Yep.
and so we just felt there was a lot still to do to enable the product that we were already having a lot of success with, enable that for our customers so that they could operate anywhere in the world, right?
Yep.
And when we looked at how many developers out there were using these products, we saw the same needs, and we felt that like we should just focus on making sure that we can serve our customers wherever they're operating. I remember early on in our international launch, we partnered with Uber, who had
Mhm.
challenges in launching in Paris, and so
Mhm.
we were able to help get them launched and enable communications
Mhm.
for them
Yep.
in Paris back in the early days. And so that was just the focus of the company. Was we had a thing, it was working.
Yep.
We wanted to make sure it worked everywhere in the globe, and
Mhm.
fully solved our customers' needs. And you know the focus we had was to take telecommunications, which had been sort of this very siloed by country, by carrier
Mhm.
set of services. And for developers who sort of were born in the web era, they just
Mhm.
assumed like, hey, it should just work. And when I launch my thing, it works everywhere in the world. And that was just
Yep.
not how telecommunications was. And so, a lot of what we did, honestly, in those super early days, was just trying to figure out like, how do we scale this thing? How do we get it
Mhm.
working as reliably as it was working in the
Yep.
U.S., everywhere else in the
Yep.
world, and enable these type of experiences so that for developers, they could deal with the telecommunications network of the world as a single abstraction and a single API endpoint. So that was sort of where we started, and so it stayed just SMS plus the voice product really until we launched incremental countries, but really
Mhm.
until about 2014.
Yep.
Because we were focused on expanding that footprint, getting coverage in every area code and in every part of the planet first.
Yeah, and honestly, that's a journey that still continues today, right? It's
For
a
sure.
huge, hairy, complex problem. You've got a 30+ billion-dollar company that's still working to, get sufficient coverage in Africa and India and other countries.
Yeah, that's a never-ending problem. I mean, just getting high quality, reliable support everywhere in the globe is just an ongoing effort. And I mean, the team now working on it, is massive, and
Yeah.
and yeah, and it's a huge business now, and but that was sort of our focus early on, was just like, can we get this product working
Mhm.
for our customers? Because developers want a single abstraction. They don't want to have to think in their app and write code like, if
Mhm.
it's the UK, then I want to do this. If it's I send an email if it's the UK, but if it's the US, I'm going to send an SMS. Like you don't want to have to think about all that complexity when you're building
Yep.
your application. And
Yep.
I think having sort of gone through those lessons at Twilio, when we first met and you sort of pitched me on what you were looking to do with Courier, I saw the same pattern playing out, except rather
Mhm.
than the complexity of the global telecommunications network. It was a complexity of all these new emerging ways in which customers are communicating with each other, and companies now want to be able to communicate with their customers. And so trying to figure out how do you get that right abstraction where you lift away a lot of that complexity is a big part of why I was excited in our early conversations.
Yeah, and I think there had been some attempts at Twilio to solve something similar, and so maybe tell us a little bit more about Twilio Notify, because so you've evolved from SMS and voice, and you mentioned a few minutes ago push was something that you started to integrate via Notify, and I think Notify had support for email as well. Can you remind me, like, what did Notify look like, and why was it being built?
Yeah, so Notify was going after a big part of this problem, which is that companies need to communicate to their customers in many, many different channels, and so we've sort of taken the approach of, great, how do we plug all those different channels into the core platform? I think the thing that we found as we were sort of going down that path with customers is they needed both the connectivity into all those different channels and support for that, but they also needed kind of a new abstraction, right? They needed to build in a bit of a different way than they built before, and so that was a lot of the inspiration around getting that plugged into the Twilio platform and trying to enable that. But meanwhile, even as we were doing that, things like Slack were blowing up, right? And so the communication landscape is not a static environment, right? and now you're seeing even new communication tools that the Clubhouses of the world, and now Zoom is Zoom wasn't what it is today. It wasn't even a few years ago, right? And so communications is constant evolving thing, and making sure that you're continuing to build and integrate with those services, I think, is pretty core. I mean, we went through big part of what we were doing was we tried to figure out, like, what are the key building blocks, right? We felt that connectivity to the telecommunication network was a key building block. We also felt, we launched Twilio Video in 2015, and that was really around, like, hey, if we're going to power all the world's communication, and that was sort of that remains the vision of Twilio, we really needed to have all the right building blocks, and video was obviously one that was missing. Email was obviously one that was missing, that Twilio was able to solve with the SendGrid acquisition. And so that was sort of the approach that we took. Like, what are the key fundamental building blocks that developers will need to build any type of communication experience? And then there was sort of a long bet on developers that they'll figure out new and innovative ways to use these communication technologies that frankly, we couldn't even envision.
Yeah, I want to tie together 2 points. Earlier, you were talking about how there's really two kind of, I forget the way you put it, but basically, like, globally addressable ways to contact a user, phone and email. And that's still pretty true, because when we think about all of, to your other point, there's a proliferation of new channels that has really only accelerated, if anything. But they tend to all be walled gardens now, right? What does that mean for, is that something Twilio thought about? Like, you could build a solution for SMS where you're sitting over top of a number of different carriers that are fundamentally working off of a standard protocol. But now you have, Slack and Microsoft Teams, and they're all, like, kind of maybe conceptually work chat products, for example, but with completely different APIs, completely different protocols. How did Twilio think about that during your time there?
Yeah, I mean, it's super tricky. Yeah, that walled gardens, I think, maybe not exactly the right way. They all have sort of their own addressing mechanisms, is kind of how I would probably think about it. And so, many of them have open available APIs. So it's not as though they're walled gardens. But, like, if I asked you what was your push token on your phone, like, you don't know. If I ask you what your Slack UID is, you probably don't know, right? And so the way that I've sort of always thought about it is that essentially you had these IDs that were sort of globally a global addressing mechanism, which is what the phone network is, and what the email addresses are, which is a sort of global unified addressing mechanism. And then you have a set of sort of siloed addressing mechanisms, despite the fact that there are available APIs. And I think that just adds a ton of complexity to, and I think part of the reason you don't see as many apps on some of these other platforms in the same way that you see all the folks that are using the Twilios and the SendGrids of the world, I think is a function of the fact that there's this addressing problem that now every developer needs to start thinking about. And so I think really that change in how these platforms evolve has sort of shifted the thinking of like, what is the right abstraction to build that eliminates a lot of the complexity on these developers, just that they aren't needing to keep track of every one of these different addressing mechanisms for all these different emerging platforms. And so I think that's sort of that's been the trickier part, is that end users don't know their address in almost all of these. And so if you told me like, hey, would you like for me to get in touch with you? It's like, well, yeah, absolutely. But there's really only 2 identifiers I can give you that, will help you get in touch with me. And so I still think that email and SMS remains certainly in the business to customer realm, the least common denominator of communication. Everybody has it, right? And it's something that you can count on and is available. And so I think that level of that addressing challenge, I think, remains one with these platforms. And I think a lot of things Courier is doing help actually simplify that for developers out there. But I still think that's been one of the big barriers to a lot of these other platforms.
Sure, and I think it kind of begs the question of if we've got these globally addressable channels, right, like email, especially in Western markets, everybody's got an email address, and you're pretty likely to be able to get an email address from somebody, right? It's I would say in the phone number side, people might be more reluctant to give you their phone number. I don't know if that's changing or not now, but certainly people have given up and they'll give you your email address. That's just part of life. So if we can always get somebody's email address, why would we want to message people on other channels?
Well, I think that the use cases and the way I always talk about it is like the level of bandwidth of the communications matters. And so I think, as there are different use cases where I want a different type of communication and a different level of urgency around it. If it's PG&E telling me that, hey, or Cal Fire telling me that, we've had a lot of fires in California lately, so it's top of mind. It's like, I want that very urgently. I want a voice call that interrupts my day, that is able to sort of tell me what's going on. Yet, I think in a lot of instances, I may just want an email that's sort of passively in the background, saying like, hey, your rates have changed. Like, probably don't call me and tell me that I've got a change in my rates. And so I think the way, at least I think about it, is that you need to modulate the relevant communication channel for the type of communication that you're sending to your end user, and to the preferences of those end users, right? And so that sort of matrix of business knows, is this, get out of your house now? This is an evacuation warning, some type of critical communications like that. And then user knows, hey, for these type of messages, I want to be able to be communicated to in this way. Or maybe in this tool, right? Email versus the SMS inbox versus, wanting a bot that's, will communicate to me in Slack. That all sort of needs to get resolved. And I think that the challenge has been, this is complex on the user side, which is like, what are your preferences and how do you want to be communicated to? It's also challenging on the business side, because if you want to let me as an end user have a variety of different preferences around my communications, there's a lot of work you need to do to build the appropriate infrastructure to let me basically be able to be communicated to in the way that I want, right? And so I think what ends up happening is that everybody's sort of de facto pattern here is, I'll just send you an email and I'll send you all the things, right? And or I'll send you a push notification on all the things, or I'll send you, it's just all the things, because it's hard to do this right. And I don't think, from my point of view, I don't think businesses want to upset their users, right? Like the businesses are not like, what I love? When my users think everything that I'm sending them is spam and they're annoyed with my brand. Like that is just not a thing that businesses want. But to do it correctly, to send the right notifications at the right time, in the right channel, that itself is a very, very tricky task. To know that, like, hey, when I'm on a call, I don't want this. When I'm when this is these are really tricky problems to solve. And so I think a lot of companies just don't get around to doing it.
Sure.
And I think that's actually the real challenge here, is that you have complex addressing, you have complex preferences on both sids, and there's a lot of engineering that needs to go in to build that type of infrastructure. And so there's a set of sort of the way I always think about it is like those with notification privilege, right? There's like a set of companies that have invested in these like highly advanced teams that have built this, and you've shared a number of times the Slack notification workflow. It's like like Slack put a lot of time and effort into it and tried to get this right
very early on.
Facebook, and Facebook has similarly invested in these things, but that's great if you're Facebook and Slack. What does every other business do? And who is sitting there helping every other company that similarly wants to give their users control, but and support for many different channels, but just doesn't have the time or the team to actually invest in it.
Yeah, I want to come back to the Slack point, but I also wanted to briefly, like, I really liked the way you put it that channel preference is going to vary by person, obviously, but also by basically the content, basically the purpose of the communication. And I just think as humans, we intuitively and naturally do this every day with our friends and colleagues, right? And I think probably within the last 24 hours, I'm pretty confident I've sent you both an SMS and an email for different purposes, right? Same person, but I was picking a channel and just subconsciously, like, this message makes more sense to go to Pat over this channel, and this message makes more sense to go to Pat over email. And I'm sure that, like, in my head, there's some algorithm running to say, like, what's less likely to annoy him, what's more likely to get a response, like, and I do the same thing with my wife, with my coworkers, but businesses don't, right?
Yeah, businesses don't, right? And I think it's not because they don't want to.
Yeah.
Like, it's because it's hard to do this correctly.
Yep.
And that algorithm, part of that is a function of knowing the preferences of the other person. Right. Knowing that, like, oh, for this person, for example, I know my mom, like, I just give her a call because, like, I can text and it doesn't go, there's a lot of back and forth and not a lot of information exchange when I'm texting my mother. And she's just much more comfortable with a phone call and sort of traditional, like, let's just connect and talk it through. And so I think this is sort of negotiated both between our human to human relationships. And I think what really needs to exist is that businesses need to understand both what our preferences are, and then and they have knowledge of the type of content that they have, what's mission critical, what's not, and be able to sort of adapt to use the right level of bandwidth for the type of content that you're trying to communicate. But it's very tricky to do, and I think there's just not a good way to do this. And I think if you're going to look at the market, we've gotten a lot better at adding more and more channels. Really, in the last 5 years, there's just been this explosion of channels. But figuring out the right channel at the right time, with the right set of preferences, is really, really, I think, still a fairly unsolved challenge, especially for these businesses that want to do the right thing. It's just hard.
Yeah, and that brings me back to the Slack point. And for those that don't know, both Twilio and Slack are investors in Courier. I don't know that Stuart would agree with this, but I actually think notifications and their early investment in them is one of the big reasons why they launched off so quickly, right? So I was a HipChat customer for years before Slack hit the scene, and I wasn't terribly tied to it, but I remember kicking the tires with Slack and finding it pretty comparable at launch, right? It was a little bit hipper, but when people say, well, the UI was a lot nicer, HipChat's UI was fine. It wasn't like super old school. They had invested in it, but for me, a big difference was the notifications, and they were one of the earliest ones to invest in multi-channel notifications, of saying, hey, when something happens, we need to let you know if somebody's mentioning you. Otherwise, what's the point of all of this? But we're not going to send it to you on multiple channels at the same time, right? We're going to figure out, do we route it to mobile push? Do we route it to in-app? Do we route it to email? And we're going to apply some intelligence for that right channel, right time, right person kind of methodology that you mentioned. My gut is that was one of the big drivers, because I remember on Hacker News, like people, railing it. Why aren't we just using IRC, right? That was like the common refrain on Hacker News. And one of the big complaints about HipChat at the time was that they felt like they were just getting spammed on notification channels, right? That they were just like, you would get in that mention, and regardless of if you're just sitting there staring at it, boom, you get an email, right? And so it just blew your inbox.
Yeah, I think for sure. And I think what it allowed Slack to do is you just could use Slack. You just put more and more stuff into Slack because you had the ability. So just more and more content was able to go there without everybody being like, this is annoying. I don't want to be in this tool. And so it allowed everyone to basically have the flexibility to have, the right set of settings. And I know probably the place, when we started using Slack, where like our on-call channel was, there's a very active area in Slack, but like one of the things that was good was that, like, depending on your status and your role in the team and what was going on, you had the ability to have the right settings there so that it wasn't just completely overwhelming. But it took a big investment, right? And these are not trivial problems that I don't know the size of the team that built out, that probably still runs all the notification preference stuff. It's like, but I'm sure it's not a trivial team there. And certainly the teams that we were working with when I was at Twilio, teams like the Uber team, and so they had pretty decent sized teams that owned just making sure that the preferences were right. That you got a push notification at the right time, or that you got a text message, or that the driver was able to call you, and getting those experiences right was a big investment for these companies.
Yeah, I mean, last I checked, I think there was a team of 10 over at Slack, and that's about par for the course for large companies. I know of several companies that have significantly larger teams than that, just focused on building notifications, but 10's pretty common.
For sure.
One of the things I think, when we first met that I shared with you is one of the reasons I was building Courier was because I had needed it. I was previously CTO of another company, was building out a system where we needed, I would say, Slack-esque notifications. We had a collaboration element to the product, and one of the things that we wanted to do is let users know when other users are trying to get a hold of them without annoying them. So we wanted to follow kind of the standard Slack style, and this is true for a lot of robust communication or collaboration tools. Hey, if the other user's online, show them an in-app notification like a badge or something. Don't annoy them. If they're not, but they have the mobile app, send them a mobile push, and finally fall back to email if neither of those work. Sounds really simple. Turned out to not be as simple to implement as I thought. And one of the ways we got connected is I actually went over to Twilio to talk to some friends and said, if anybody's going to have a solution here, it'll be you guys, right? And they pointed me to Twilio Notify. And earlier you were saying kind of finding that right abstraction level was the hard part. And that was the bit for me that didn't quite fit, and why I ended up starting Courier. One of the things that we haven't really talked about, we've talked about address management, right? We've talked about routing to the right channel based upon preferences, based upon the content and purpose of the message. One of the things we haven't talked about that is quite complex, and I would say wasn't really addressed with other attempts at solving at that abstraction layer, is the templating side, the actual content, and the way you build the content in a way that can be used across multiple channels. I'm curious, did that ever come up at Twilio? Is that something that there was ever was that just not something that was in the bones to try and address, or did you look at addressing it, and where did that stand?
Yeah, so it was not the thing that we were primarily focused on. We really, and I think a large part of what we were focused on was getting access to all these other channels, right? Yep. And we saw developers were the ones that were basically figuring out how to use them at the right time, but we wanted to enable all the different channels, and so development teams were basically building a bunch of the content authoring, in-house, right? And that was sort of in their systems, right? And I think as you and I were sort of whiteboarding and talking through, in the super early days of Courier, I think one of the things that I thought was super interesting was decoupling the developers who had a set of events coming out of their system, right? That maybe they wanted to notify on, maybe they didn't, right? That
Mm-hmm.
they had sort of a series of different things that happen in their software that they
Mm-hmm.
wanted to potentially inform users about, but not always. And I think
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I really liked about Courier was just getting the right abstractions in place, right? Where there's events that are generated by your applications, right? Those events may or may not result in a notification, right?
Yep.
And the notifications can then be designed and authored by the designers,
Mm-hmm.
the PMs, the growth teams in your organization. And then the way in which those basically get communicated is informed by the preferences of the end user, right? And that sort of decoupling of the developer needing to know the end user preference, which is sort of in every other version of this that I had seen both with our customers,
Mm-hmm.
the development teams that were performing the notifications also were responsible for the preference management,
Right.
and that coupling, that tightly coupling of those two things,
Mm-hmm.
I think is what it made these things far more complex. And I think one of the things I
Yeah.
really thought about and really was excited about when we were first chatting was your sort of notion of let's decouple these two things.
Yeah.
Let's allow preferences to essentially then be something that developer doesn't need to be aware of. They just need to know about what their event did,
Yep.
what is the relevant information from that event, pass that along to Courier, and then Courier will figure out where I should send it, how it should look,
Yep.
and sort of that decoupling
Mm-hmm.
of the actual what results in the end user delivery, the canvas
Yep.
of that delivery was, I think, sort of core insight that you had that made me really excited about what you're building.
Yeah, I think, the reason why we ended up there is I think, I can imagine a world where if we were starting from SMS, right? SMS has kind of some of the simplest content expectations. It's quite constrained, right? Both in length and in terms of the richness of the content. I know there are, upcoming protocols that are hoping to expand that, and we'll see if when those happen. But when we start to look at other channels, all of a sudden, both the complexity of the content that you can create increases, but also the complexity of what it takes to represent that content, right? So email is kind of the canonical, like, you can do all the things, right? But you're writing awful HTML that's got to work across Outlook 2003 and Superhuman and
Yep.
Hotmail and Gmail, etc. And so most developers have felt that pain before. They don't love that. But I think one of the things that's more recent is when we go back to these other ICE siloed channels, as you called it, when we think about WhatsApp, right? When we think about Slack, each of them are now bringing kind of their own unique spin on what's the content, how can we represent it, what are the constraints. WhatsApp
Yep.
famously has, like, you have to go through like ridiculous bureaucratic approval to
Yep.
get the template approved, right? Here's the really,
Yep.
really thin constraints on what you're allowed to do and you're not allowed to do. Slack has their own bespoke, DSL called BlockKit that they're constantly
Yep.
evolving, right? So each one of these channels is now kind of increasingly complex. Whereas, if you were just doing SMS and voice, SMS is obviously basically plain text. And I could imagine a world where you're using like Twiml and basically taking that same plain text and just like doing text to speech, and it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, I think the thing that has sort of happened is now, as I said before, that preferences had to be sort of coupled with the application logic.
Yep.
Well, then what has happened now with all these proliferation channels is actually the templating is now coupled with the preferences, which are coupled with the application
Right.
logic, and
Yep.
and so that's where I think it gets really hairy for developers, right?
Yeah.
And by being able to defer the template plus the preferences, you can't
Mhm.
you can't sort of like unbundle these two things. They need to be
Right.
going together
Yep.
to actually simplify things for an end developer, because otherwise, even if you say like, well, we got all the channels that you need in place,
Mhm.
the challenge is you as a developer still need to know what are the rules and the constraints of that given channel,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so and it's sort of a slippery slope where now it's like, all right, well, maybe I'll just build the channel integration myself, right?
Yeah.
And so you really need to have the templating, the formatting, the rendering, all of that sort of encapsulated as part of that higher level abstraction that
Yep.
that we've been discussing.
Yep. So, you mentioned earlier that eventually Twilio, acquired SendGrid, early last year for, I think, 3 billion. So big acquisition. Made sense. It kind of, in some ways, completed the portfolio of channels that they support. And that was also, not too long after Twilio had gone public. So I feel like you kind of came full circle, right? You had started at a big, tens of billions of dollar public company and joined a small startup, and then kind of ended up right back where you were before, huh?
Yeah, and I think having sort of gone on that amazing journey, I was 7 years at Twilio. Was just super excited to jump back into the smaller startup world, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, shortly after I left Twilio, you and I sort of got to chatting. This is obviously an area I've been super passionate about for a very long time, and excited to see what you and the team have been building and where it goes from here.
Yeah, well, founders often will ask me for advice because we raised our seed round pretty early, and I always kind of unfortunately tell them that I think it's kind of non-reproducible. I'm like, if you can find a Pat Malatack, somebody who's a investor who has spent 7 years building in your space and has thought a lot about your specific product, then you can reproduce what happened. Otherwise, I don't know that my advice is completely transferable. But obviously, Matrix doesn't only invest in companies like Courier, but where we were very early. Where does Matrix
Yeah.
typically invest?
Yeah, we're typically doing, seed and Series A,
Yep.
and so we like to invest in founders and product ideas,
Yep.
and we certainly are not, the way we sort of joke is like we're not spending our days in spreadsheets modeling,
Yep.
growth rates and things like that. We want
Right.
to think about like, well, what should exist and what type of gaps do we think there are in the market, and I've been spending a lot of my time thinking about what I've been calling meta SaaS, but basically, you see a lot of these attributes in Courier, which is that there's been this giant proliferation of SaaS, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about any company today, when you start your company, you get like 20 different SaaS tools. You plug them in. You're like, now we're a company, right?
Yep.
And there's like Zendesk in there, and we were fortunate to be investors in Zendesk at Matrix. But you got Zendesk in there. You got HubSpot. We were investors in HubSpot as well. And you were using Twilio or SendGrid to talk to your customers. So you have all these different SaaS platforms that you as a company are using. And I think one of the challenges that there's a lot of complexity now when you then try and ask the question of like, well, what's the experience my customer is getting, right? Because there's this one set of experiences they're getting inside of their customer support tools like Zendesk. Your HubSpot marketing automation is doing a different set of things, and you don't realize that like your marketing automation is trying to sell the next thing when when your customer's already has a problem and is on customer support and you haven't answered in 2 days, right? And so trying to sort of understand how now in this world where there's all these different SaaS products that are out there, trying to get a cohesive view of your customer, of your employee, of notifications with Courier is sort of just an area that I've been spending a lot of time, and we've obviously made those investments in many of the SaaS companies along the years, but we've now also started sort of really looking at a lot of these sort of meta SaaS, these sort of layer that sits on top of all the SaaS infrastructure that's out there. I sort of see Courier as part of that for notifications. And then, we've also, my partner Ilya invested in a company called Fivetran, which is really reaching into all those different SaaS products so that you have a unified view of, inside your warehouse of everything that's going on. And so, so that's sort of an area I've been spending my time, and at Matrix, I'm super excited. If folks have ideas in this space, I'm really excited to talk to folks because I think it's sort of a missing layer now that needs to exist for many of these services because many companies are just powered on so many different SaaS tools that are out there today, and they don't all talk well together. And so I think that's a real opportunity out there that I at least personally have been excited about.
So if someone out there is a founder who is starting a company, looking to raise a seed round, maybe they've got a company they're looking to potentially raise their A, What's the best way to get in touch with you if they think it'd be something that would be up your alley?
Yeah, absolutely. Just shoot me an email, patrick@matrixpartners.com, and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. And I'll at the very least get you an answer of like, hey, this is interesting, and here's why. Or if it's not, I'll also sort of say why I'm not interested in that area. But just shoot me an email. I'm happy to chat with anyone. And I think for me, I always love spending time with teams just to learn more about what they're building and where they're going. So I'm always happy to jump on a quick call and learn more.
Yeah, and having been that founder not so long ago, I highly recommend folks take Patrick up on that offer. Hey, Pat, it was awesome to spend some time kind of going through your time at Twilio and just kind of the evolving communication landscape. So thanks for spending some time with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and super excited about Courier and the product that you built. I really think it's the right abstraction for developers and the world of notifications. And so couldn't be more excited to be working with you and partnering with you on this journey.
Cool. Thanks, Pat. So everybody go check out matrixpartners.com as well as courier.com. And thanks for spending some time with us today.
Cool. See ya.